Hey everybody, I'm Lex and welcome to Words of This Life.
I'm gonna run, and even if I fall, I know I'll be safe in my skin. Hey, hey, hey.
In my last video, I talked about my first day in prison, and I mentioned that there was a sort of second first day in prison that I wanted to share about, and that is my first day in the Youthful Offender Program. So to give a quick overview of what the Youthful Offender Program is, in Florida, there's a statute that if you are 21 and under, when you are sentenced with felony charges, you can be put into the Youthful Offender Program. There's other criteria that you have to meet as well. You have to have certain types of charges, a certain length of sentence, that sort of thing. But if you are sentenced as a youthful offender, then you, in the state of Florida, then you will end up in the Youthful Offender Program. Now, there are cases where if you meet certain other criteria, you can actually be up to 24 to be put into the Youthful Offender Program. So even if you weren't technically sentenced as a youthful offender, the Department of Corrections can classify you as a youthful offender when you get there. And so you could be up to 24 when you get placed into that program. Now, one of the main purposes behind the Youthful Offender Act is that you would be separated from the older and more experienced criminals, and therefore, hopefully, increase the likelihood of your rehabilitation because you've been kept away from them. And so, under the Act, youthful offenders are given more opportunities for vocational programs, education, and then they have to take substance abuse and other rehabilitative sort of classes. Now, maybe I wasn't at Lowell long enough to see any of this happen, but I don't remember any of those opportunities, counseling or vocational or education-wise. I don't remember any of that being offered to the youthful offenders there. Again, maybe I wasn't there long enough, but I just have no recollection of any of that. I did go to the psychiatrist, but as usual, they just doped me up on a bunch of meds and sent me on my way. I would not consider that to be counseling at all. Now keep in mind this was 2005, so things could be different, but because I tend to think pretty cynically about the prison system, and for good reason, I would imagine that things probably haven't changed much for the better by this point, but it was 15 years ago. So the day that they brought me from the annex to the main unit to the youthful offender dorm, which I'll just call the YO dorm from now on because it's easier, I was in for a rude awakening. It was a real culture shock. I mean, you've got women in there, or girls, should I say, from the ages of 15 to 21. I believe the youngest that you could be in the YO program was 15. Most of them were older than that, but you could be as young as 15 to be in the YO program. So the first meal that I went to as a YO was lunch, I believe. It might have been dinner, either way. And we get into the chow hall, and everybody's getting kind of unruly and shouting and not listening. And so one of the officers says, "Hey!" real loud. And someone responds, "B!" And then a couple other people join in, "C!" And then the entire room, except for me and the person that was sitting with me, proceeded to shout the entire alphabet, A to Z, at the top of their lungs. And I was sitting at the table thinking, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? I felt pretty mature. Looking back, I was not mature, but I felt like in comparison to those people at that time, I felt pretty mature. And I was just thinking, ugh, I'm in here with these babies, you know? That was denial. I really wasn't that mature, but I just didn't feel like shouting out the alphabet while we were trying to eat lunch. I don't know. And this was the kind of stuff that happened every day there. These kids, these young women, they just did not care. They fought with locks and socks. They defied and yelled and overpowered the corrections officers. They stole passes and went to unauthorized places in the prison. Actually, that was me. I was in on that one. Maybe that's a story for another time. They did drugs. They had, how can I say this, relations in the bathrooms. They just did not care. Oh, and speaking of the bathrooms, getting moved to the YO dorm was a big wake-up call because on the annex for intake, the shower stalls were stalls. There were walls in between them. And that was not so in the YO dorm. It was a giant open room with shower heads. So basically, I just didn't want to shower. I mean, I did, but I didn't want to. So while the YOs were often wild, they just really were. They were pretty much constantly wild. The COs were just nasty. They had nasty attitudes. They would make sexual comments, were totally apathetic. It was not at all the rehabilitative environment that it was supposed to be providing for these youthful offenders or for the adults. In fact, Lowell Correctional Institution has a long, well-known history of violating human rights. They've been under investigation by the DOJ for emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. It's a really bad place for women. And now, in recent years, former inmates have been taking to social media to share their stories about their experiences with abuse while they were at Lowell. I don't remember how long I was at Lowell before I was transferred to Hernando, which is the prison where I'd end up spending most of my time, but I was super, super relieved when we got there. Lowell houses about 3,000 women, and Hernando only houses about 470. So it was much smaller, and I think by nature of that, just less crazy. It was also minimum security, so you couldn't have more than a 10-year sentence to be able to stay at Hernando. And it doesn't mean that it wasn't crazy still. It was just honestly less crazy in some ways, because it seems like people felt like they had a lot more to lose because they had 10 years or less, as opposed to Lowell, where you have lifers and you have kids that are going to be in there for 25 years and things like that. I will say that the YO program at Hernando looked a lot more like what it was designed to be, where you have opportunities for counseling and classes and programs. And right after I got there, I was assigned to GED classes because I had dropped out of high school early on in my sophomore year. So they immediately want to get someone who doesn't have a degree plugged in to work on their education. So I studied for that and got salutatorian of my class. But before it sounds like I'm tooting my own horn, let me remind you that we were in prison and it was my GED. I was still proud though. It was still a big accomplishment because I had left school with honestly no intentions of returning at any point. So it was great that they pushed me into doing that. And then because of my score, I was assigned to assist the teachers in the GED classes. So there's something to put on a resume, right? And during that time, I also took a Microsoft certification class, Microsoft Office. So we learned all of the Office programs. And I also took an Adobe PageMaker class. I was also assigned to a drug program called Modality. And this was a pretty intensive rehabilitation sort of class where we had individual therapy and group therapy sessions as well. And I mentioned in a previous video that I had a lot of panic and anxiety issues that followed me into prison naturally. And a lot of that happened during these groups. I absolutely hated being called on to share anything. That there were times that I would just put my head down in my lap and cry and wasn't even able to share. But it was hard. We had to dig into a lot of things related to our addiction. And so looking at some of the patterns that we had and how addiction affected our lives and how it affected the lives of the people around us was really hard to do, especially in an environment like that. It just felt even more vulnerable than it would if you were just out in the real world meeting with a counselor. So our days in the YO program, especially compared to the adult side of the prison, were pretty rigid. Monday through Saturday, we got up really early. I don't remember the exact time, but I do remember it being exhaustingly early. We'd have to get up and make our beds army style with the little envelope fold at the bottom and all of that, have everything tucked away, and basically it had to look perfect. And we had to stand at the ends of our beds at parade rests like this. And then they would come around and check our beds. And if it was to their liking, then we could go on about our day. If it wasn't to their liking, we would have to remake the entire bed or fix whatever it was that was messed up. And in some instances, I saw officers rip apart the bed to show their disapproval. Instead of just saying, this isn't good enough, you need to fix it, they would just flip the bed, pull all the sheets and everything off of it, redo this. And it all seemed very boot camp style, especially because after we were done with that and everybody had had their beds checked, we would get in lines and we would march out to the road, the main road. We called it Main Street or Front Street. And we would do calisthenics or PT, and then we would march to breakfast. And we'd get to breakfast, we would have 4 minutes to eat. 4 minutes from the time we got in, grabbed our trays, sat down, ate everything very quickly, and then had to leave. And then we would march back to Main Street or Front Street, and then we would do a flag ceremony. And then we had to march back to the dorms for count time, and then we would be sent off to our job assignment for the day or work call. They would call out work call, and it was different for everyone in the morning and the afternoon. So it was classes or it was inside grounds jobs where you're doing maintenance and things like that on the property. And it could be anything from cleaning the dorms to pulling weeds to painting to cultivating the baseball diamond. They would send us out there, and sometimes in the dead of summer in Florida at 103 degrees, you're out there standing on this big clay baseball field diamond thing. Obviously, I'm not a baseball person, sorry. And you're just cultivating. You're cultivating the clay of the baseball diamond. Busy work, anyone? That's exactly what that was busy work. They had so many of us and not enough things to do around the prison, I guess. So you're out there just cultivating the clay. After the morning job assignment, we would march back to the dorms, have another count time, march to lunch, have another 4 generous minutes to eat our meal, and then march back to the dorm again for another count time, and then we would go out for our work call assignments for the afternoon. And if you had classes in the morning, you generally had something more maintenance or grounds related in the afternoons. And if you had maintenance or grounds in the morning, then you would have classes in the afternoons. Oh, and about the meals, we had to go to every meal Monday through Saturday. On Sunday mornings, we were allowed to skip. And so you could actually sleep in if you wanted to on Sunday mornings, which I did not do very often. Number one, because I did not have a lot of money for commissary food. And number two, actually this might even be number one, is that often on Sunday mornings it was SOS day, which is biscuits and gravy, and then coffee cake. So I loved both of those days. Call me institutionalized, I don't care. I would probably eat those meals now. I don't know, I feel like I should take that back. I might not eat them, but man, they were delicious and I looked forward to those Sunday mornings. Ah, the hats. I have to tell you about the hat system. Colored hats help distinguish us from the adults in the prison. Even though we were separated by a fence, there were definitely times where we intermingled, and so they wanted to know if you were a YO or if you were an adult. We had to have these hats on at all times if we were outside of our dorm, unless we were going into another building. So if we were going into the chapel or into the warden's office, which was not usually a good thing if you were going into the warden's office. But if we were going into another building, even the chow hall, we had to take our hats off and fold it and then stick it into our belts so we could still be distinguished from the adults wherever we were. There were levels of colors or phases, I guess. So when you arrived to Hernando, if you were a YO, you were given an orange hat. And that just meant that you were in your orientation and everybody knew that. You were learning the ropes, you were learning what the days were going to be like, you were learning how to hopefully stay out of trouble. And then if you kept your orange hat for 2 weeks without getting in any trouble, you would get a red hat. And if you kept a red hat for 4 months, you would get a blue hat. If you kept a blue hat for 1 year, you got a white hat. But in the time that I was there, I think there were maybe 6 or 7 white hats total. So a lot of us had a really, really hard time even keeping a red hat. So 4 months doesn't seem like that long of a time. Let me just put it this way. It took me 2 years to make it to a blue hat. I obviously was causing trouble and not doing what I was supposed to be doing. And if you got, I think it was 3 CCs, which were a type of write-up, or 1 DR. A DR was a disciplinary referral, and I, for some reason, can't remember what CC stands for. So if you know, let me know. If you got, I think it was 3 CCs or 1 DR, you would end up in a yellow hat. So the phases were orange, red, blue, white. But if at any point in any of those phases you got in trouble, you would end up with a yellow hat. And then after you had your yellow hat, you would go back to the color hat that you were before. Actually, no, that's not true. I think if you got a yellow hat while you were a blue hat, you had to go back to a red hat and start all over. So one of the things that you saw with most of the blue hats is that they were just more well-behaved a lot of the time, or maybe better at not getting caught. Although I will say, having spent time, a substantial amount of time in the regular dorm and the blue hat dorm, there was a really different feel to it. The blue hats were typically more respectful to the officers, at least to their faces. And they just tended to listen better. And so it was really a great thing when you made it to the blue hat dorm. But like I said, a lot of us had a really hard time achieving that. I got some CCs for really stupid stuff sometimes, but my biggest problem was that I got transferred back to Lowell a couple of times for psychological emergencies. So it's called a psych out, and there were different reasons that happened for me. But every time that I went back, I would come back in an orange hat. So even if I had had my red hat for 3 months, when I came back to Hernando from Lowell, I would be in an orange hat again. So that process started over for me quite a few times. And like I said, it took me 2 years to get to that point. But by the time that I was able to phase up to a blue hat, I had so many people cheering me on because so my life had changed in the middle of all of this, and I became a Christian, and people saw super crazy Lexi. I mean, super crazy Lexi. There are people probably watching this that could attest to that. And they saw super crazy Lexi change. It was just like night and day, and everybody saw that. So the blue hat was a big deal for me. And I was actually supposed to phase up to a white hat the week before I left. And I was so excited because I don't know that I ever thought that I would make it to a white hat, but when I kept my blue hat for a year, I was like, man, I have a week left here and I am now able to phase up. And I'll have to share in a different video about what happened. The warden actually made the call for me to not be able to phase up. And I was super, super angry and super sad. And yeah, I'll have to share about that another time. But anyway, I would have had a white hat. And honestly, in my heart, I consider myself a white hat because I had worked my butt off to get to that point, to go from being such a crazy person to someone who was able to get to the point of having a blue hat and not just having it, but keeping it for a year. And you know, I felt really ridiculous wearing those hats back then, but I look back at it and think about how helpful it actually was for some of us because it really was a reward system. I mean, there were also demotions in there where if you did something wrong, you would be demoted to a different hat color and have to start over. But there was always this goal in mind of, okay, if I can accomplish this, I get to actually move on to something. And then even creating the habits of, man, if I work hard, this pays off. So while in general, the system is very corrupt, I think the idea behind the Youthful Offender Program is a good idea. And I think that for the right people at the right time, it's actually going to catch and actually going to help people. And then one of the reasons that they do the YO program is to decrease the recidivism rate because 8 out of 10 people that go to prison go back. So they want to see that number be significantly lower for the youthful offenders. And in a lot of cases it is. So something that they're doing is helpful, but it's not the officers doing something great. It's not the design doing something great. It's the hearts of the people that are in the program and something happening within them that changes and clicks for them. So we've talked about the rewards system or aspect of the Youthful Offender Program. Let's talk a little bit about the punishment aspect. The most obvious punishment for both adults and YOs was confinement. If you fought, if you disrespected an officer, if you stole from someone, if you got multiple CCs and DRs, you would end up in confinement. But for the YOs, we had some other punishments too, like being dropped. When you got in trouble for something, you would have to drop in the middle of everything, in the middle of everyone, and do push-ups. Or you would have to march. And often when we got dropped, if you were with a group of people, everybody would get dropped. And if you were with your whole dorm when you got in trouble, everybody could be punished. You would all have to march. And so if you're on your way to lunch, you're marching to lunch, it's 100 degrees outside, it's summer in Florida, everybody just wants to get there. Somebody does something stupid, everybody would have to march. You'd have to go up and down that street until your marching was just perfect. And then you're hot and you're cranky and you are being corporately punished for the stupidity of one person. And to make matters worse, often the blue hats or white hats, if there were any at the time, were assigned to march the other hats or the other dorm. So you would be, as a blue hat, giving them instructions. That was just kind of awkward because here are your peers, your fellow inmates, and they somehow have some kind of superiority over you, or it felt like they did at least, because they're marching too, but they're kind of calling it out and giving you instructions, and you have to listen to them because if you don't, you're going to end up getting in even more trouble for yourself and for your group. And about getting dropped, even as I got stronger, which happens when you get dropped a lot, it was still really embarrassing to have to do that, depending on where you were and how many people were around, and also depending on the officer, which I guess kind of brings me to the last thing that I will share about today. And unfortunately, this is going to get kind of heavy, but honestly, that is kind of inevitable when you're talking about prison, because while there are funny stories and all of that, it really just is a horrible place to be. And there are a lot of bad stories, and a lot of them revolve around the officers. We had a lot of officers that were definitely power trippers, that definitely preyed on the emotionally weak and abused their authority. And to me, a few of them at the time stood out as nice and friendly, but in hindsight, I think for me personally, it was because they were flirtatious. And coming from the lifestyle that I had lived, I was all about that. I was a broken young girl, desperate for attention, desperate for someone to lead and guide me, desperate for a father figure. And a lot of those officers seemed to, in a very crooked and weird and unhealthy way, feel that sometimes. And so there were officers that could be total jerks, but if they would give me the time of day, then I could overlook those things because I was getting attention. And it wasn't just me. That was very, very common, and is very common in women's prisons, because you're in such a vulnerable place, both physically and emotionally and spiritually. And unfortunately, when you are in a position like that, it lends to those unhealthy connections with the people around you, because negative attention was better than no attention. It's sick, it's corrupt, and in a lot of cases, for a lot of women then and still, it results in abusive situations, emotional and physical, and sometimes sexual as well. And I didn't fully realize the severity of all of that until I started to be able to see some of the unhealthy patterns in my own heart and see how wicked of an environment it was that I was in, and see how unhealthy it all was. And around the time that my life changed, that I became a Christian and that things became really different for me, there were some officers who made some comments to me and about me to each other, and I knew what they were saying behind my back, because they would make very blatant comments to my face as well, or in passing, just walking by. And it was heartbreaking, because a lot of them were the ones that were cheering me on and that were telling me, you can do this. Every time I would get back from a psych out, you can do this, you're stronger than this, you know. Like I said, kind of that desperation for a father figure, when you have someone cheering you on and then you get to a better place, and then all of a sudden they're making these jokes that were basically an inside joke to them. It was very, very embarrassing. I was full of shame, full of paranoia, just thinking. I knew that a few of them talked about it, because they would talk about it around me. And I always wondered, how many of them know? How many of them have talked about this? And I still look back at that and realize that it was very traumatic. It was very traumatic. And I know that I'm not the only person that that sort of thing happened to. But by this point, I really just felt like I had no voice. Even though things had changed for me a lot, I kind of felt even more silenced by this point, because early on, I tried to speak up for someone who was hurt by an officer, and it did not go well. I was threatened. I was terrified. And so even being the bold and outspoken person that I normally am, I feel like being in prison just silences that. You feel like you don't have a voice. You just feel like, as I've said in another video, garbage. And so many things had changed in my life, and I was finally coming to a place of accepting who I was and accepting that I was in prison, and feeling like, okay, there's a light at the end of this tunnel. And then I had these officers just take a lot of that joy away by the things that they were saying. It was very inappropriate, and I felt like I couldn't say anything. And again, that wasn't just me. There are situations that happen like that a lot there, but it was very, very personal. So just pray for people that are in prison, because yes, they committed a crime, in many cases a lot of crimes, and have done terrible things. But even with all of that, they are not deserving. We were not deserving of the way that we were treated. I am going to leave it at that for today. And I'm sorry that we had to end on such a heavy note. I also realized that I give a lot of details, but you might have more questions just because of some of the things that I shared. So if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below, or you can shoot me an email. My life is an open book. My prison experience is an open book. And so if you find yourself curious about other things, please let me know and I would be glad to answer. Thank you guys so much for watching. I would be so grateful if you would like and subscribe, and of course feel free to share this if you think that it would be helpful for someone else. If you've been here before, thank you so much for coming back, and if this is your first time, thank you for stopping by, and I hope to see all of you again next time on Words of This Life.